Well, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. I know we're reaching the end of the meeting, so I appreciate you sticking with us. We're excited about the panel we have today. We titled it International Influences on Employment Relations Practices and Labor Responses. We have 4 speakers. I'll be going last. We'll go in the order of the program. I am not going to give long introductions. There's bios on the website. So I'm just going to introduce folks by their name and their affiliation and the paper title. And we will start with Ginny Park. It says Cornell University, but she graduated from Cornell. She is with us at Penn State as a postdoc, and she will speak on the US and international actors in Cambodian labor politics. Ginny, the virtual floor is yours.
So, shall I start now?
Yes, please.
Okay. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Very clear.
Okay.
Yeah, now it's in presentation mode.
Okay. So thank you for coming for this presentation. So I will talk about the role of the US and international actors in the Cambodian labor politics. So my research started from very small, interesting episode from my fieldwork in Cambodia. And one of my interviewees told me that the US is the godfather of industrial relations system in Cambodia. So it was surprised me somehow because it is different from our conventional understanding about the industrial relations system, which saying that 3 domestic actors, employers, government, and the trade union. So what happened? But it might be possible during this globalization, era. So I developed my research question, say that how the globalization, or more specifically, the global supply chain has been influenced on the development of national industrial relations system. And I took the case of Cambodia with 2 reasons. So Cambodia started the industrialization quite recently, like the mid-1990s, due to the civil war. And this country took the development strategy to incorporate their economy into the global supply chain. So it's an interesting case to show that how the institutionalization of industrial relations through the under the influence of global supply chain. So my main argument is that intervention of international actors has been resulted in the building the industrial relations system based on their own ideal model and reflecting their own interest. And it provides some short-term gains to the labor movement, but hampering the long-term effectiveness of the labor, the local labor movement. So we talked about, scholars talked a lot of institutionalization or institutionalism, the emergence or development and change and sustainability. But there's not so much literature talk about the actors, especially the external actors, influence of external actors. So one of the rare study done by the Peter Evans talked about the institutional monocracy. In the development studies, he pay attention on the behavior of international development agencies to bring the institutional frame outside of, based on their own experience in their home country to implement in the global south, with the expectation of global economic development will be going well with this institution, but always get the disappointing outcome, which means it didn't contribute so much for the development itself. So I use this frame and developed my own theoretical frame, saying the institutional implantation of an IL system. So I am more focused on the process of institutionalization. So there's by foreign actor, with based on their own experience and reflecting their interest out of a local context. So methodology that I use the data from my fieldwork in Cambodia. This is a list of my interviews. I interviewed all the relevant stakeholders in the industrial relations. And one of the prominent historical context of this country is this country suffered from the civil war, which ended in early 1990s. And during the civil war, the country lost 1/3 of its population. And mostly the Khmer Rouge targeted intelligentsia or educated people because they believed these people were the enemy of the working class. So at the end, there's one or two generations of educated people disappeared. It's a massive loss of skilled and educated population. And this country also lack of natural resources, which means they doesn't have so much to export. So the country naturally depend on developed their industrialization strategy, economic development strategy based on the export-oriented sector. And they heavily depend on the international support for the rehabilitation and the economic development in terms of fund, in terms of knowledge, in terms of other skills. So that if you think about the export-oriented sector with the low skill, naturally it's garment industry, right? So still, the garment industry is the major industry in this country. So more than 60% export comes from garment industry. 1/3 of real economic, the GDP growth comes from this garment industry, and they export 600,000 workers in the 600 factories, plus 400 subcontracting factories. And the major market is US and the EU. And the US is sometimes, so more than 40% of garment product, that went to the US market. The US was one of the biggest partners. This is the number of the garment factories in the year 1999, it's 20s, increasing a lot. So from the beginning of this rehabilitation and industrialization, US engaged deeply and together with ILO. And actually US had a free trade agreement with the Cambodia, saying that if you improve the working condition, we will increase the quota to the US apparel market. So because it was under the Clinton administration at that time, and the Clinton administration want to have a kind of good case to show the benefit of the free trade, and convince the union that this free trade could improve the working condition in the global south. But they need someone or somebody to monitor or make a guarantee, make sure that the working condition has been improved. So they asked ILO to take the job. So ILO set up the kind of monitoring system called Better Factory Cambodia. It was funded by the US and operated by the ILO. And also they need a kind of proper process to deal with the dispute, not go to the directly strike. So they set up another dispute resolution system, mainly represented by the Arbitration Council called AC. So BFC and AC, Better Factory Cambodia, and Arbitration Council is a kind of, until now, people say that only two properly functioning industrial relation system. So it is implemented the implemented institutions. So in a sense, it's a lack of enforcement mechanism. The arbitration council's award, it is non-binding. There's no way to make it implement. And it is isolated from other local institutional bodies such as the labor inspection department and the court. But in the sense that local unions actively use this system, and they use the arbitration council award as a tool for the advocacy to the international brand, and the international brand go to their supplier and say that, oh, you should respect the arbitration award, arbitration council's award. So it's heavily, in this picture, this heavily depend on the international actors. And the international campaign.
2 minutes, Jenny.
Yeah.
2 minutes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
2 minutes?
2 minutes, yeah.
Oh, okay. So in this case, the international campaign is main channel to enforce the arbitration councils. So it really proliferate, because the power from outside, not inside of the union. So proliferation of small trade union dividing the union movement. So 3,000 unions in the 600 factories. So, and the government, the union doesn't need to deal with the government. So they developed more apolitical unionism, pay little attention to the government and the politics, focusing on the more immediate gains. So, but there's a question of the sustainability, how it goes if government change their strategy and decide to intervene actively and then restrict the unions, which is happening now. And so in the conclusion that these international actors bring make up a lot great contribution and a big contribution to build an industrial relation system based on their ideas like seeking monitoring and seeking the industrial peace. And also, especially U.S. want to have an immediate indicator to build to improve the working condition. But these institutions may bring the short-term gains and a kind of useful tool for the unions. But the unions may lose a chance to have an internal democracy. What kind of institution they want, that kind of chance to develop, to discuss. And at the same time, they may lose a chance to develop the political muscle, and that they don't learn how to deal with the government and how to deal with this political situation. So in that sense, I can say it's a long-term loss for the labor movement. Okay, done.
Perfect. That was perfect timing. Wonderful presentation. Thank you, Jenny. So next up, we have Scott Martin of Columbia University and Joao Paulo Candia Veiga from the University of Sao Paulo. They will present on the evolution of private governance of labor standards compliance, the case of Brazil's garment supplier code. Scott and Joao Paulo.
Hello, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Mark, for organizing this, and to Rose for officiating, and to my colleagues, Joao Paulo, who's here present, and our in absentia colleague, Katusha, who's also been part of this project. And this project really grows out of earlier research that they conducted. Why have Brazil in a panel about international influences, you might ask? As the 8th largest country in the world, not a major exporter, the presence of international influences and actors comes through the actual presence in the country of large retailers, supermarkets, and fashion brands selling to Brazilians merchandise that is manufactured in Brazil primarily. There are some imports, they're fairly minimal exports. So the game in Brazil, as a large, relatively still self-contained, if open market and globalized in terms of tastes and fashion, it's different, politically, institutionally different than it is in a country perhaps like Cambodia or Bangladesh, or some of the countries that have driven our understandings about labor standards in what I'll call here the national node of a global value chain. Our research here, this piece of the research is centered on the relationship between private governance and public regulation because of in the midst of a push for labor enforcement in the late part of the first decade. An association of Brazilian large retailers, both foreign and domestic, which pre-existed as a lobby group, decided to form a code of conduct and a supplier development program and an auditing scheme, in part as a defensive response to growing cases of forced labor within their supply chain, particularly from second and third tier small immigrant, informal, undocumented labor sweatshops, mostly peopled by immigrants from neighboring countries like Bolivia and Peru. So we have this confluence then of public and private regulation, and this has been a subject in the literature where one school of thought has traditionally focused on the displacement effect, whereby private schemes, private compliance initiatives tend to hollow out or further hollow out already weakened public regulation. But more recently, sort of complementary hypothesis positing potential synergy in identifying empirically cases as well as theoretical conditions under which one can get complementarity between public and private. With some of the authors mentioned there, I don't need to probably belabor this for this group, but this school of thought was particularly influential for a number of Brazilian scholars and their international collaborators listed there on the slide, because they did empirical research and they found really in this period of the 2008, 2013, 14, across a variety of agro-extractive sectors, important synergy between a professionalized labor inspectorate, often with a rewarding regulation or root cause regulation capacity, held to be important in the literature, but together with this private initiative where retailers were trying to really do the right thing. And of course, the ILO has also, even while placing primacy on private or on public inspection, has published pieces calling for more effective integration of public and private. But there's really a third logical alternative if you go to the literature in the work of the Trebecks about both labor and environmental standards, what they call public-private rivalry, where you have two systems that compete for dominance and an uneasy coexistence where neither displaces the other. They kind of exist side by side, but they really don't inform or improve each other mutually. And that is where we find Brazil today, 10 years after this private governance institution. Brazil, we'd argue, is a crucial case for examining public-private interplay because it meets some of the conditions in terms of state capacity, professionalized inspectorate, institutions of labor enforcement in the legal realm. Because of these other experiences studied in other sectors of the Brazilian economy and its sheer importance for the global debate as the world's 4th largest garment maker by value and its 3rd largest apparel market. And as mentioned, the 8th or 9th largest economy in the world. So I think for all those reasons, it's internationally relevant and important to look at. And it probably fits into a subset of countries for whom most of the garments that they make, even if they export them, most of their domestic market, which is large, is serviced by domestic production, even in a globalized value chain. So we argue in brief that there's continued rivalry between the public regulation and private governance. And it has to do with limitations of institutional design and strategy on the part of the private governance scheme, which is business driven and retailer dominated and driven by private CIT certification, inspection, and global multinationals as the auditors, or those who subcontract the auditing to freelancers. But on the other hand, there's also a declining institutional capacity of the inspectorate, reflecting not its professionalism and its meritocracy, but rather its declining resources, both human and institutional, over the course of this past decade. And what we found in our interviews is really on both sides a perception of a lack of communication, coordination, and trust between the two actors, where they're often working at cross purposes and critical or resentful of the actions of the other. Just briefly, this is some of our, we drew on data from interviews, qualitative interviews. More recently, we conducted surveys of auditors and suppliers as part of the Capstone Columbia project with the Agribusiness, and a benchmarking exercise where we compared Agribusiness to 5 different international schemes, which Agribusiness would like to learn from in trying to improve its scheme. don't need to belabor these logistical details, but here's a list of some of the international brands that might be familiar to some of you who are part of Agribusiness, in addition to the many Brazilian firms. Those within the scheme have to be 100% certified in their supply chains, a whole supply chain within 2 years. The suppliers bear all the costs and indeed choose among the auditors. Those are some of the basics of the scheme, which has grown over time in the number of retailers who are members.
You're at 2 minutes to go, Scott.
2 minutes.
Yep.
We're at a plateau now in their growth. They're about 21 to 22% of the total market share of retail sales in the Brazilian market of apparel. But you can see there a huge reduction in the number of suppliers from July 2014 of around 7,800 down to 4,100 or so 2.5 years later, and then staying below 4,000 ever since then. So the program has functioned as a tool of supply chain winnowing through really a cut and run strategy where there's no support for the productive and social upgrading of firms. Those who couldn't meet the tests and had red line violations were simply excluded or self-excluded. And there's been a big first-tier consolidation and verticalization among suppliers. And that's borne out by some of the data about the size of firms that we have comparing our most recent survey with a survey 4 years earlier conducted at the University of Sao Paulo. So the forced labor problem has not been exorcised, it has been externalized to the rest of the sector. Sorry, I have my timer, which still constitutes more than 3/4 of retail sales in Brazil, because forced labor cases continue to exist. There haven't been new cases for Agribusiness certified firms in the last 3 years, but nonetheless, you can see here a kind of skipping ahead to another slide, that overall, while forced labor, the freeing of forced laborers by public inspectors and other authorities has decreased in frequency annually from its heyday around 2013, 2014, it has continued on a fairly straight line since 2016, 2015 really. And so there's still cases, and what we find is really
wrapping it up. Yeah, sorry, just that
a much reduced inspectorate in size, that's 40% smaller than it was earlier in the decade, is spread thin, and it focuses all of its resources on raiding workshops where, with other public authorities, where it's tipped off to the presence of forced labor, but it's not able to engage in routine inspection. And for its part, Agribusiness is a retailer-driven, business-driven scheme with its private auditing without good transparency of its audits or results of audits or identification of the supplier chain. And so the potential for public-private complementarity, which was highlighted by a Brazilian inspector and an ILO researcher, Postuma, writing in 2013, 2014, has not been realized in practice, we find, because neither the institutional conditions in the private governance scheme nor the subsequent development in the institutional capacity of public regulation have been able to sort of fulfill those expectations, which I think were plausible and realistic at the time. But since then, Brazil's economic and political and other circumstances have changed radically. So that's the sort of highlight of a interesting but abortive case of potential public-private positive interplay that hasn't turned out well in practice.
Great. Thanks, Scott. Really fascinating stuff. You can see some chats are starting to come in there. So we'll pick that up in the discussion part. Let me now turn it over to Matthew Fischer-Daly, Cornell University. We're switching a bit now from, we've done focus some on garments. We're looking at agriculture now in the next two presentations. He will talk on collective action, confronting precarious employment, comparative labor regimes in contemporary agribusiness. Matt.
Thanks, Mark. And
I think, Scott, you're gonna have to stop sharing your screen so then Matt can start sharing his.
Okay, sorry about that.
okay. So I'll just start chatting while we get the screens going. But thanks, Mark and Rose, for organizing and moderating this panel. It's a pleasure to be with you all. See if I can get this up. Are folks seeing my screen?
Yep.
Okay, great. Today I'm going to talk specifically about commodity chains as labor control systems. The emphasis on control dynamics of commodity chains aims to contribute to the debate over the socioeconomic impacts of what are variously called commodity chains, global value networks, and global supply chains. The evidence to support this argument is from a case study of the labor regime in strawberry production in the San Quintin Valley of Baja California, Mexico. This case study is part of a larger research project studying the labor regimes in the production and sales nodes of strawberry commodity chains in North America and Western Europe. Due to the pandemic, field research is on pause. This is all part of my dissertation. So today's presentation is based on the first site visit, which is in the San Quintin Valley. So the San Quintin Valley is a key production node in the North American strawberry industry. Strawberry production in the valley increased 195% since 2000, supporting a doubling of US per capita consumption of strawberries over the same time period. In 2015, most of the 80,000 workers who work in the fields in the valley organized a strike and blocked the highway used to transport products to market, which is primarily retailers in the United States, 200 miles north of the valley. So what you see there is the workers blocking the highway. Now today, 5 years later, the San Quintin Valley workers are not represented by any union at the workplace. Most workers do not receive legally required benefits, and women and indigenous workers are restricted to the hardest field work at almost all agribusinesses. So the question under consideration here is, why did assertion of evident structural power have such meager outcomes? We can quickly gather that workers face price elastic demand for their labor and low strike leverage relative to their employers. To understand why this is the state of bargaining power, the approach taken here is to analyze the sets of relations involved, that is, use a commodity chain analysis. So what do we understand about commodity chains? Well, world systems theory says that capital operates globally, and the chain concept exposes power relations underpinning unequal exchange. Global commodity chains and value chains literatures focus on inter-firm relations, arguing that firm arbitrage of transaction costs creates value, and lead firms govern suppliers with varying degrees of intervention. Increasingly, scholars are centering the labor theory of value in chain analyses, recognizing labor as the source of value, observing financialized monopolistic power supporting the capture of value by lead firms, and identifying conditions that make labor super exploitation possible, such as enclosures and proletarianization, creating wage dependency, as well as the construction of identity categories used to stratify workers. So regarding methods for this case study, I spent 2 months earlier this year in the San Quintin Valley, interviewing mostly workers, some managers, and conducting participatory observation. I'll say more about how this case fits into the broader study of labor regimes in the strawberry sector at the end. To quickly note here, this image is of workers in a strawberry field at sunrise in mid-March. To observe are 2 points. One, their position, which is hunched, an agonizing position after a few minutes, let alone for years. And the highway next to the field, which is the transportation from the valley to US markets. That's where you see the power lines in the background. Before laying out the argument of commodity chains as labor control systems, we should visualize the commodity chain under study. The boxes are a simplified representation of the tasks that constitute the strawberry commodity chain, in which the San Quintin Valley is a central production node for North America. The cycle of investment to production, circulation and consumption, and reinvestment moves left to right. Concentration of power surrounds dispersed production. So each stage is dominated by 1 to 4 firms, except for production, for which there are at least 50 agribusinesses in the San Quintin Valley. So as you can see, in terms of varietals, there are 2 entities, one Driscoll's, another the University of California in production of strawberry varietals, and so on down to food retail, in which in the United States, 4 firms control 42% of the sales. So focusing on the labor process, when you view this commodity chain, it suggests that labor control operates on 3 levels. One is structural, meaning the industry is organized to facilitate capture of value by lead firms with concentrated market power surrounding production, as seen in the previous slide, the location of production based on low unit labor costs, which in Mexico are 50% of United States unit labor costs, and mobile capital. The other structural dynamic is the structuring of the labor market, which is organized to facilitate superexploitation through the making of wage-dependent migrants by enclosing alternative livelihoods of indigenous communities in southern Mexico, and the division of labor on ethnic and gender lines. Now, the second level of control is political. National states, in this case, Mexico and the United States and Canada, but primarily Mexico, provide infrastructure, privatized land and water, as well as market access. And in San Quintin, the Mexican state does not enforce rights established in law, including freedom of association, remuneration, and anti-discrimination. Most workers, for example, do not receive payments, healthcare, pensions to which they're entitled, because employers do not register them or pay into the Social Security system. Owners are all considered mestizo, that is, including European heritage, while 80% of workers are indigenous, identify as indigenous. And among wage positions, women are blocked from many, such as tractor driving, irrigation, fertilization. The third level of control is at the firm. Here we see the 3 forms of control argued by Richard Edwards,
2 minutes.
meaning simple, technical, and bureaucratic. And each of those is reinforced by workers' contingency, meaning their survival and their reproduction of labor power are contingent on the market. They do not have access to alternative livelihoods, and therefore are subject to these other forms of control more severely than they would otherwise be. So the second main point of conceptualizing commodity chains as labor control systems is that managerial control is evidently rife with contradictions. At the structural level, dispersion of production produces structural power for labor, which is pronounced in the strawberry sector. Production location is limited spatially and temporally by climate and location to market. The San Quintín Valley in particular supplies strawberries in February through April, when North American retailers would otherwise lack supply. The chain is thus vulnerable to disruption in the valley during the harvest. This is the dynamic taken advantage of by the workers in the 2015 strike. In terms of stratification of workers based on gender and race hierarchies. These hierarchies are in fact in the valley serving as what Kimberly Crenshaw called potential coalitions. The organizing of the 2015 strike was based on indigenous identities. And women's experience of discrimination at work, as well as in the labor movement, has led them to organize their own collectives, which are currently engaged in educating workers on legal rights, first response to domestic abuse, pressuring employers to open up higher paid positions to women. And their work is shaping the strategy of the independent union that was registered after the 2015 strike.
Matt, so you're at 10 minutes, so just if you.
All right, I will wrap up noting the last piece is how firm controls end up exposing a lot of the claims of conscientiousness to be more about marketing than they are about protecting workers. We can get more into that if folks want to discuss. Finally, to note that labor's challenge, broadly speaking, is the mirror of the lead firm in the supply chain, which is to control value throughout the chain. In labor's case, to control access to labor power. So I'll leave it there and be happy to discuss more of this, including next steps in this research during discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Matt, wonderful. So I'm gonna, let me.
Should I stop share?
So let me try now to do the share. Is that coming through? Is that good? Yeah. Okay, so this is, let me start my timer. This is a new project for me, new in two ways, looking at a new sector, bananas, looking at a country I haven't studied carefully before, Guatemala. And you'll see, you know, actually, maybe it's studying agribusiness. Matt and I coincide and overlap quite a bit in our framework for this. I should say just a little bit of background. This was, I confess, a bit donor-driven. I was approached by the Solidarity Center and asked if I could do a research report on the conditions of labor in the sector. And I became very, very interested in it. And I started by really looking at the history. The point, of course, was to study contemporary conditions. But, you know, a couple things stand out when you take that long historical perspective. You know, banana supply chains are global supply chains that go back well over 100 years. So the idea that globalization and supply chains are something sort of following the oil crises and the second industrial divide and all that in the 80s and 90s, this suggests otherwise. The other thing, when you take that long-term view, you see actually a shift from producer-driven, controlled by the fruit companies, to buyer-driven, the importance of retail. In Guatemala in particular, we can see a really dramatic changes in the states, not at all linear, but very dramatic changes. And we see corresponding changes in labor patterns of labor resistance. So I'm going to put up one slide on that, but I'm really going to focus on the second point, which is the contemporary period. So here I hold the sector constant, bananas, the state structure in Guatemala constant. This is roughly 1996 to the present, in a sense, after the Civil War ended. But here there's two sources of variation that interest me. One is public versus privately held firms, lead firms. And the other is whether it's directly owned farms or indirect or outsourced farms. And that'll give us some sense of variation in outcomes for workers. I'm not going to belabor this, but it's similar in very many ways to Matt's framework, this idea of three levels of interacting control. At the micro level, Mike Burroway's work at the workplace regime, the meso level, the national level, and through the supply chain macro control. So we could go back to that later if that's helpful, but that's the main theoretical framework I'm working from. If we look, and this is again my one slide on the history, we look at Guatemala, it really fascinates me. You know, I could write a lot about this. You know, you have a period of very extreme dictatorships. You have this period of the so-called Guatemala Spring, when there's a very progressive government. You have authoritarian rule and civil war, and you have the sort of current period of limited democracy and control. For the fruit companies, it's really fascinating as well, and we map this on top of that. You have these initial banana enterprises that were very decentralized. They merge into what becomes known as El Pulpo, the octopus, the United Fruit Empire. It then breaks into the three big fruit companies we know today, Dole, Del Monte, and Chiquita. And now in the current period, we see the rise of the retail sector, and we see some of those companies going private. Again, I'm not gonna, for time, go into detail here, but I argue that this corresponds to several different patterns of labor resistance. And this is, again, the period I'm going to focus on. So the contemporary period, just for a bit of context, again, similar to what Matt was talking about in terms of prices, we're looking at a sector that there's a very strong economic squeeze. We're looking at bananas at the retail, the cost of, imports, holding steady without controlling for inflation, about 20 cents per pound for bananas. Retail prices holding steady roughly around 60 cents per pound. 62% of value is captured by retail. This is the other breakdown. Production labor, including managerial, is about 14%. So production workers would be well below 10% of the retail price. More dramatically still, when we talk about Guatemala, is the violence. So bananas exports are soaring in Guatemala. Guatemala now is the third largest exporter of bananas in the world. Banana exports, the value is greater than the value of coffee exports in Guatemala. It's also greater than the value of value added in garments in Guatemala. And this takes place in, most folks recognize Colombia as the most violent place in the world to be a trade unionist. That's true in terms of total numbers, but in terms of killings per capita, Guatemala is the most dangerous country in the world to be a trade unionist. When I was doing field research in Guatemala, I was struck, I was driving around with colleagues there, they were pointing to the spots where unionists had been killed. And I became very interested in not only the number of unionists killed, and you can see there's 101, but the geographic dispersion of those killings. So I came back, and with a graduate student, we mapped it out. And those are the killings in Guatemala during this period. And what you see is this is the area on the southern coast where banana production has now become very concentrated. It's entirely union-free. A lot of the unionist people were killed trying to form unions. It's 85% of production there. It's outsourced and it's non-union. When we look at, this is sort of my framework, when we look at the structure of the supply chain globally and in Guatemala, again, we see the rise of the retail sector, the power of Walmart in this case has, right? These fruit companies don't sell the fruit directly, they all go through the retail sector. It used to be the fruit companies set the price and supermarkets just sold at the price they were told to. That's flipped, and that's why I said we've moved from a producer-driven to a buyer-driven supply chain. But the other thing that's changed is the privatization of these, some of these companies. So Fresh Del Monte is the only publicly traded company left. Chiquita went private in 2014. Dole went private 2003, went public again, and went private again in 2013. And so those two remain private. So that's the public-private divide. When you get into outsourced versus directly owned, I have the figures for Del Monte because it's publicly traded. I could read the 10Ks and they have this information. So it's roughly about a third of the facilities are directly owned by Del Monte. The rest are outsourced, and we can expect a similar pattern here. Dole does not have directly owned facilities in Guatemala. So what this leads me to is some expectations. But I did a worker survey, and but what was I expecting? I was expecting the best outcome from publicly traded companies, which also have centralized bargaining, in the case of Del Monte, Citrabe Union, and direct ownership. I was expecting mixed responses in the cases when it was outsourced but a publicly traded company or privately held company, but with bargaining, with the union presence and decentralized bargaining. The worst conditions I was expecting in when it was outsourced and when it was a privately held company. And that would be the cases of Dole and Chiquita on the southern coast. So here are my findings. I did this survey between September 2019 with a group of colleagues on the ground in Guatemala and February 2020. We had a total of 210 survey interviews. All the workers were interviewed to fill out the survey response. This is the first cut of looking at the data. It's hourly wages. So box A, where I expected the best outcome. This is Del Monte, centralized bargaining, encompassing bargaining for all the firms. By far the highest wage rate, $3.16 an hour. Here's Chiquita and Del Monte, union presence, but privately held company and decentralized bargaining, a much lower rate. And then we see an even lower rate for outsourced firms with no unions. I thought the gap would be greater here, but these wage rates really are not that different. We do, however, see more significant variations in other areas. For example, here, in terms of our overtime hours voluntary, we see much more likely to have overtime hours voluntary where there's a union presence, and only 1.2% of workers responded that they had voluntary overtime in outsourced firms where there were no unions. That's right. One other question we're asking, very relevant now for the COVID case, do you have to pay for replacement personal protective equipment? Again, we see a very dramatic difference between these unionized firms, even indirectly owned. This is an outsourced Del Monte facility, and outsourced with no union. 87% of workers are paying for their replacement equipment. Lastly, I was able to ask the question about sexual harassment. So this is only responses for the women workers, and here again we see a very dramatic response. There were no cases of sexual harassment reported by the women we interviewed for the Del Monte case, sexual harassment at these levels for the other two, and in the outsourced facilities with no union, 58% of women that we interviewed reported sexual harassment. So that's I might add time. That's the response. The responses I have. This is just a picture of the Chiquita union headquarters out on the northern coast, and that's their collective bargaining agreement, which they're very proud of. So certainly one takeaway is, in this context, direct ownership, publicly traded companies with centralized bargaining engender the most favorable responses for workers. Thank you. And with that, let me turn it over to Rosebot from Cornell, who's going to lead us off with some questions. Rose?
Yeah, no, I was taking notes like crazy, and I actually have about 15 minutes of comments, but I won't do them. But I did want to highlight just a couple of things that I think are really important about this session. The first is that, well, I first highlight that a number of the authors and people in the room, including Kelly and Mark and who else is, I'm not sure who else is there, are participating in a special issue on labor regulation and global supply chain that's coming out this August in the ILO Review. And a lot of those papers are now online. And what I'm struck by with these papers is they're on the cutting edge of the kind of next round of debates over the kind of interaction of public and private regulation, different approaches, different levels of analysis, and moving to a much more complex understanding of the institutional mechanisms, both of labor control and of labor resistance and mobilization. And, you know, if you think about this, we now have 30 years of deep research on global supply chains going back to all the Nike protests in the 90s, and a pretty simplistic view of private regulation, and then we were looking at when it worked and when it didn't, and then the labor associations in private monitoring. But this new set of papers and new level of research really takes it to a very different level of complexity. And I'm not going to go through, I think that the things that are striking, the first two papers, they're really kind of best case scenarios. And so even in the best case scenarios, you see where the contradictions emerge between either long-term and short-term and long-term sustainability in both Cambodia and in Brazil. And then the last two papers on the agricultural chains, Matt and Mark, are looking much more, they're really mapping at this point the levels of control across macro, meso, and micro levels, and the great difficulty in control. And of course, the question is, where do labor organizations have points of leverage? I think for Matt, where he's still trying to figure that out. And Mark, of course, has a great answer in showing the really positive effect of unions in the case of bananas, where there has been a greater history of unionization. So I'm going to stop there, but I think the discussion could move towards this issue of labor capacity and sustainability, institutional sustainability in these regulating these supply chains. So thanks. Great papers.
Thank you so much, Rose. Very, very helpful feedback and reflections on them. So let's just open it up now. I know there's questions in chat. I'm always not the best when I'm listening and also chatting. So anyone, even if you put something in a chat, if you want to speak up and ask the question out of the group, please do so. So the floor is open.
I can say more.
Yeah, we could look at some of. There's some different questions. I mean, this question of Chiquita. Joca's mentioning it. When it went private, it was Brazilian capital. There's also Swiss capital involved. They have offices outside of Geneva. They have not raised wages in Guatemala since it went private. They've been very, very, very tough negotiations with the union there. They've been just held up at an impasse in bargaining since it went private. For me, it raises this question. There used to be a discussion years ago, as publicly traded, was that the pressure for the quarterly reports and the bottom line, was that going to push down on labor more than a privately held company? And I think Rose's work helps answer that question. When you get into private equity and other types of forms, actually, you can see how much more challenging it can be when a company goes private. And as a researcher, I can tell you how much more difficult it is when you can't read a 10K. The unionists get the same thing. The unionists in Guatemala at the Chiquita facilities, really have no sense of what the margins are, when they can push, how they can push. So it's really quite significant, the challenges that creates. Again, any questions? Jenny, please.
No, I received several questions.
Please, yeah.
I answered in private, but it's better for me to share the answer. And actually, Cambodia, one of the questions I had that Cambodia is kind of, I need a kind of counterfactual case to compare to Cambodia. Actually, I tried to check whether any study study about the role of international actors on the domestic industrial relations system, which I could not find. So the Cambodia cases might be a kind of extreme case for the U.S. to intervene such a level, but I also see the similar level of engagement of the ILO in Myanmar. So I think there's a kind of there's several factors that why these the countries or some states more under the stronger influence of the international actors. That there's another studies, but I think one of my contribution might be thinking that way, that we may extend our understanding of the global supply chain, the relation of the global supply chain and the domestic international the industrial relations. The global supply, expanding of the global supply chain or expanding of the global economy may open the space for the international actor to intervene the local domestic labor affairs. That's maybe we can, I can say more in general rather than the specific case from the Cambodia.
Good. Thank you, Ginny. Yeah. Anyone else? Any more questions? Go ahead, Scott. Yeah. Scott, you're on mute.
Just to throw out a provocation, since there's a lot of discussion about better work in the thread, but also to bring in Joao Paulo to the discussion. So it's occurred to me at times that maybe Brazil needs more rather than less international, particularly ILO, because of, the ILO is involved in a way in the backdrop promoting a cooperation, but and responding to the inspectors union complaints about the unfilled positions and a decimation really of its resources and staff. But if in the foreseeable future the public sector is not going to be able to play the role that it was a decade or so ago, and this private governance scheme doesn't have the incentives to beef itself up and become more robust and rigorous, maybe there's a missing actor, whether it's ILO and better work or something like that, or it's more learning of activists in Brazil from some of the strategies abroad of activists of trying to engage more critically those initiatives, the private initiatives, and really hold them accountable, which is what happened, I think, over time, around the turn of the century in the US with, FLA and WRC. Brazilian activists are used to targeting the state, not to targeting private governance schemes, and that's in a way a blind spot, I think, for them.
Great. Thanks, Scott. So I see Janice's hand, but Scott did invite Joao Paulo to jump in. If Joao Paulo, do you want to add something now? And I also see a question from Matt.
Yeah, just to put old argument comparing labor standards and environmental standards. People from management and business used to say it's more easier to provide incentives to improve the compliance of the private sector, considering the environment standards than labor standards. They also always said, oh, it's labor, it's more complicated. We cannot provide certification schemes. It's more difficult to pay attention of the customer. This is an old argument. It's always used by people from management and business. Yeah. So I think it can help explain the case of ABV tax in the retail in general. That's my point.
Thank you, Joao Paulo. Very helpful. Matt, do you want to jump in? There's a question for you.
Sure, it might be quicker than trying to type it. Johnny had a question about sources of power for workers, which I think builds on Rose's observation that in the banana case, the workers, clearly have a map for how they organize. And in the strawberry case, I'm, kind of speculating about what are their sources of power. That said, I think there's some really interesting work in the strawberry industry by the workers to recognize that there are real spatial and temporal limits to mobile capital. And so in North America, there are really 5 places that are producing strawberries for the whole industry. And there are 4 retailers that dominate almost half of sales. And there are some workers, including the folks that I was speaking about in San Quintin, who are developing alliances with workers in the United States, as well as some of those workers in the United States participating in something called the Food Chain Worker Alliance, which is looking at the possibilities of cross-chain solidarity between the labor-intensive nodes of the supply chain, where in sales and production. So I think those are some of the areas where you see the possibilities of stronger worker power and assertion of that structural power that's kind of latent.
Great. Thanks, Matt. So I see we're about out of time. So unless there's any pressing,
can we hear from Janice? I think we'll just take a minute.
Janice, yes,
more.
sorry, I did see your hand.
I just had a question I have. It relates a little bit to Cambodia, that when the U.S. agreement was over, you saw this real change in the Cambodian government's attitude towards certain laws and putting in various laws that restrict strike power, which of course is going to undercut unions. And I was just wondering in Cambodia, but also in Guatemala, whether you see members of government benefiting, when I say directly, maybe covertly, but directly from company investments. In other words, quickly, if you're in Cambodia, you might say the government just wants to attract a foreign investment, and so to be real friendly to it. Once the United States has dropped out its commitment, it's doing that. Or you can say that members of the government of Cambodia actually have interest in those factories, and they want cheaper labor also. And in Guatemala, somebody once told me, and he's not in agribusiness, it was a multinational doing something else. He said the real issue is that it's the government, and the government is linked to certain interests, and they benefit from suppressing labor rights, and it's the government. And he said, admittedly, other companies, including foreign capital, are sort of bystanders, and maybe we should take a stance. But he said, but that's Guatemala. So I just wonder whether either, Mark or Ginny, whether you have some insight into that.
Ginny, do you want to go?
Yeah, it's the capital is not only the issue of the having more factories, it means more job, more tax, and also bring the political stability by providing the economic means to the workers. So the last one seems more crucial to the workers, to the government and the Cambodian government. So, and currently, and the before it was is a kind of my impression, my understanding is that Cambodian government was confidently believing that they keep this labor movement in a box, separate box. So not watching, it's just keep it and then just deal inside the box. There is some way to deal with the labor unions through especially through the pro-government trade unions. So, but this trend changed, this situation changed since the workers' massive strike in year 2013 and 14, the shaking the belief of the government about the political stability and keep the union in the box. So that's why there is a question of stability, the sustainability of these institutions.
Just briefly, Janice, thanks for the question on Guatemala. I think this is where it helps to have that long historical view, right? So Guatemala and United Fruit was where we get the term banana republics. So if I try to unpack the term banana republic, what is it? It's basically, I would put it as an extreme form of MNC state capture, right? I mean, that was what was going on with United Fruit for many, many decades. When you get to the post-war period, we still have cases, I mentioned the violence, at the Del Monte, there was a tipping point afterwards, but at that the Del Monte unionized facilities, there's this group of facilities there, packing houses and farms. The entire union leadership was kidnapped, and there was someone in management that was connected to it, and they negotiated a deal, and they were pushed into exile. And it was afterwards that they really start to institutionalize the collective bargaining agreement and the sort of more of this kind of shared values and so on. And so when we see the fragmentation, the problems the unions are facing today, to say, well, the Guatemalan government is this, you know, that's the weakness there is absolutely tremendous. You know this from the ILO. I mean, they're still getting called out for just how bad the labor laws are. You're looking at less than 2% unionization for the entire country. But that legacy, that 100-year legacy of what these companies did, you know, weighs heavy on the current context in the country.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks, Rose. Yeah, thanks everyone. It was very good. There's some of the slides. I have a paper. Some it's on the website if you're looking. You know, so you could check that out. But thanks everyone. Thanks Rose. Thanks all the participants and the good questions. And enjoy what's left of the meeting. Take care, everyone.